It's just for the, it's for the thing.
Okay, we're ready when you are.
Okay. Pena, so I'm very pleased that a friend of mine is here, the fabulous Kamin Mohammadi, who's an author, journalist, broadcaster, and public speaker. Kamin was born in Iran. She and her family moved to the UK during the 1979 Iranian Revolution. She has written widely as a journalist for British and international press, including the Times, the Financial Times, all the way to The Guardian, and she's also a travel writer, travel guidebook writer, and she has co-authored The Lonely Planet Guide to Iran. Her journalism has been nominated for an Amnesty Human Rights in Journalism Award in the UK. That was, correct me if I'm wrong, coming for a piece about the work with the chemical victims during the Iran and Iraq war.
Civilian victims of Saddam's chemical attacks in the 80s.
Okay. And then you've been awarded for another award, a National Magazine Award by the American Society of Magazine Editors in the US. And if you could fill in what, there was another piece about Iran.
Another piece about Iran, that was a long form essay that I wrote for this literary journal, and I think it was called something like, sorry, I can't remember the correct title, but something like lust, religion, and the binary code. So it was about how it was, and you won't find it on my website or anything because it's about. Oh, sorry. So it's about sex. So obviously I hide it from my family, but it is out there. So it was a little bit about kind of how in Iran couples get together and, you know, their sex lives, essentially, which I think everyone thinks they don't have.
I'll be Googling that all, I think. And we were really? Okay. Yeah. Of course, what we're all talking about all the time. Yeah. That's what happens at the castle. Kamin is also the author of two books. One, I think that's your first book, The Cypress Tree, which is about your family's history. You were back in Iran, and you're sort of going back and finding out a bit more about the whole history and what happened during the revolution. And the second book, which came out last year, I think, Bella Figura, is about Kamin's arrival in Italy, or coming to Italy really to write The Cypress Tree, and then not really leaving. That's 10 years ago or something. Okay, so everybody, that's Kamin, and I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to her just as much as I do.
Thank you, Cash. Thank you so much. So I'm obviously, being Iranian who has transplanted herself to Italy, I think you can probably pretty much assume that I love food, and I'm really passionate about it. And people say to me, when I was first here, I'd meet Italians, especially women, and they would say, "Why on earth do you want to live here? You know, you're from London, huh?" And I was like, well, because I fell in love with the tomatoes, honestly, and genuinely I did. And so I want to fill you in a little bit about why that's so important to me, maybe, or as an immigrant, as a refugee. As Katya mentioned, I was born in Iran, and I grew up in Iran until the age of 9, at which point we had to run away from the revolution. That story is told in The Cypress Tree, which is a sort of family memoir trying to examine the roots of all of that and why the revolution happened and sort of why it happened to us. So my family's history also. So it tells the story of the country, it tells the story of our escape, and then life in exile, growing up in London, and then how I found my way back to my country, my culture, my roots. Just because so much, I think, of what we are talking about generally these days, and as part of the symposium, is also about immigration and refugees, I just wanted to read a little tiny bit of what it was like when we arrived in London. Kasia and I did a talk together the other night called Crossing Borders and Boundaries. So we were speaking really with a lot of people with two countries in their lives about this whole question of, you know, what's the difference between being an expat or an immigrant or a refugee or whatever. And there was just this real sense that so many people didn't understand the situation of a refugee, you know, and this idea that people are coming just to earn money, and that's not okay, you know. So I just want to read this little thing because I think it gives just how it felt for me, and we were lucky refugees in the sense that we didn't have to get on boats and cross anywhere illegally. My father's life was in danger, but he didn't come with us, but my mother, my sister and I escaped. But, we went on a flight scheduled. We arrived in London. We were well off. We weren't having this terrible struggle, life-threatening struggle in order to escape our country. So, and yet, I just want to read about this experience. On the 3rd of June, 1979, Sedi, who is my mother, led my sister and I by the hand from the plane at Heathrow. We'd been to London before, and this time we were arriving as refugees, not wealthy Middle Eastern holidaymakers. We were all nervous and waiting at immigration while Sedi answered the British officer's questions in the language I did not yet understand. I was almost sick with anxiety that he might refuse us entry, that we might be sent back to Iran to be killed. To my relief, we were given leave to stay for 3 months. But at that time, and every time the following year that we had to leave and re-enter the country in order to renew our stay, usually flying to somewhere in Europe for a day, I always shifted about guiltily in front of the immigration officer, feeling as if I was on the run and would be stopped and found out at any moment. To this day, even when wielding my British passport, a knot of apprehension tightens around my belly as I approach immigration. I've still not completely shaken the refugee who is convinced her safety and security is in the hands of the stamp brandishing officers, but they no longer even glance up at my passport as I pass. There's some verses from Hafez that is one of our great poets, and I think it refers to what everyone who is leaving their country and going to another place feels, and it's maybe that sometimes hard to communicate, in this atmosphere where we want to know, are people allowed to be in our country should they have left? Not in the pursuit of pomp and pageant, to this door we have come. For shelter from ill fortune, here we have come. That's just my take on just, giving an idea of how it feels, I think, inside when you are driven from your home, when you are forced to seek new pastures, even if that's about the poverty and not war. I just wanted to bring that right in at the beginning, because sometimes I think that we forget really that, people are running from something, and the little things, the apprehensions, the things that stay with you. So while I do still get nervous in front of the immigration officers, in spite of the fact that I've done, it's all right, the really positive side of my refugee experience, in a way, is about my experience with food. Now, being from Iran, I don't know if anyone has been to Iran, but we have a very, very rich culture. We have a very rich culinary culture as well, because it's a very ancient civilization. And so we've had sort of, before Islam, Iranians were Zoroastrians, and actually part of the Zoroastrian creed has sort of gone into how we cook, how we present our food, how we are hospitable to people. Our food is not just about being kind of delicious or whatever. There is actually in Iranian cuisine, there is a medical system that's a little bit like India's Ayurveda or the Chinese system of herbal medicine. It's not as well known, but we have it as well. So for us, food has also always been medicine. It nourishes you at so many levels. It also can cure you, and it's very much, the key to so many things. And not only does it have those properties, you want to balance those properties in a meal that you offer someone, but you also want it to be pleasing to the eye, to smell good, to have certain sort of color spectrum, to have certain tastes. We use a lot of, we don't use so many spicy spices, but we use a lot of herbs, we use a lot of fruit, and we have a lot of a sweet and slightly sour. So our cuisine is very, very rich, and it's very particular. It's not at all like any of the cuisines of our neighbors. It's not like other Middle Eastern food. It's not quite like Indian food. We're something in the middle, and that, funnily enough, even that has been, it's been a gift in my life and also a burden, because in the UK, let's say London now is, being so multicultural. Now there's lots of Persian restaurants and people are so open-minded there. They go, oh, let's go and eat Persian tonight. But that's only just happened. So I've spent 40 years, explaining and saying, this is how you do this. And it's very hard to communicate because there isn't anything to compare it to. Exactly. So I was thinking this earlier, as someone coming into a new culture, certainly for us, how it worked was that we came from, well, I could also just read you a little bit of, if you don't mind, another little thing about our encounter, with London in 1979 and what the food scene was like then. Because if you know London now, so you will know it's really different now, but it was not so different then. So we lived in a little brown flat and took long walks in Kensington Gardens every day. My mother made friends with an upright Englishwoman, Angela Baker, who lived in one building and who happened to be an English teacher. She agreed to teach my sister and me English, and we started to visit her flat for lessons. As she attempted to communicate with us, I took in the details of her life, especially fascinated by the little fruit bowl that proudly bore 1 orange, 1 apple, and 1 banana. Its paucity never failed to surprise me. Where were the piles of grapes, the little sweet cucumbers, the cornucopia of different fruits arranged delicately on top of each other? When at the supermarket with my mother, I could see other English people doing the same, buying their fruit wrapped in cellophane in 1s and 2s. And the fruit seemed, in late 70s London, to only mean oranges, apples, and bananas. Despite the fact that we were living solitary lives, just the 3 of us, my mother still shopped in the Iranian way, filled her baskets with all the varieties of fruit that she could find, buying in kilos rather than 1s and 2s. Before long, she found Church Street Market and Edgware Road, where, amongst the stalls run by the Arabs, we could find the large bundles of herbs, big oval watermelons, stacks of white peaches, and even, once in a while, pomegranates, sweet lemons, and the small sweet cucumbers that we cut into long slices and sprinkled with salt before eating. She found one Iranian shop at the end of Kensington High Street with stacks of lemon roasted pistachio nuts, large roasted almonds, little figs, and all the other dried fruit and nuts that always sat mixed in a bowl on our table. In our culture, the day shaped itself around food. Breakfasts of flatbread spread with a crumbly white cheese, which I love to mix with sour cherry jam. In the middle of the day, a plate full of at least 4 different sorts of fruit. Lunches and dinners of rice and khoresh. Nuts before dinner. Fruit again in the mid-afternoon, and perhaps a mouthful of our traditional ice cream late at night. And throughout the day, permanently brewing on the samovar, a pot of fragrant black tea, drank constantly and flavored with little sweets made of honey and rosewater that was sprinkled with nuts made of chickpea or rice flour into little round treats. All meals were accompanied by basketfuls of mixed herbs, which we would eat in between mouthfuls, pink radishes and various yogurt dishes topped by fine pink rose petals. That makes me hungry, sorry, just saying that. I could go on, but the seasons dictated what we ate. It went on like this. To come from this culture and to arrive in 1979 in London was really, really shocking. And it was probably one of, I had all sorts of traumas and displacement going on in that time. And that was probably one of the sort of softer but more ongoing, permanent kind of displacements that was going on constantly, which was just this inability to really connect with the food culture and to not be able to understand it. We were sent off to boarding school. It might have at that point been 1980, but my boarding school was around, I think it was still hovering in about 1951. So it wasn't really part of the modern world. We were allowed this much water in the bath, and it was sort of post-war, and the food was really shocking. Food was really, really shocking. This was the first time that I came across tinned peaches and tinned fruit, things that hurt my teeth when I ate them, and at the same time, this was something that made me feel shocked, confused, and quite sorry for the English people. Right. But at the same time, I was a little immigrant person. I was struggling to learn the language. And so I wanted to integrate and to fit in. So I learned, I learned to love Marmite, which was heroic. I think you'll agree. I did. I love Marmite. I miss it now. I have to get it sent. Yeah, sorry. So, so I integrated, you know, but I couldn't get along with lots and lots and lots of things. And at boarding school in my house, there was no choice. You know, you had to eat what was put in front of you. And so going home at the weekends was amazing because we were back, you know, back in my mother's kitchen. And actually going back to my mother's kitchen to some extent was like going back to Iran. And to this day, you know, my mother's kitchen can be one of the most comforting places on earth for me, because as soon as I walk in there, it's the smells, you know, it smells slightly of saffron, slightly of turmeric, slightly of parsley, all of the things that are really key in our cooking and that are kind of going on and happening all of the time. And I think this is one of the, when we're talking about immigration, displacement, people moving around, one of the things that is so key in this is food and our cuisine, because in that moment for me, food was something that separated me from the culture that I had arrived in, and it gave us a little bubble of being Iranian at home when it felt so difficult to be English outside and impossible to be Iranian outside. It was comforting. It was, you know, all of the things that we associate, you know, it brought back all of those memories. Of course, we could never quite in those days reproduce the food exactly as we had it at home because the ingredients weren't all available in London in that time. But it was it was extraordinarily important. And at the same time, it became a part of the culture that I, wanting to integrate and not be Iranian anymore because, you know, I wanted to be like the Brits, could also turn my back on. So one of the powerful ways in which I could express my unwillingness to keep my culture was to not learn to cook. So that my mother was an amazing cook, but I couldn't. So I could not by myself access those tastes and those memories and that comfort, which, thinking about it now, was quite an interesting position to put myself in. And also thinking about that, you know, as time went on and we had English friends and we would want to bring them home, and, you know, you're British outside the home, but Iranian inside the home. And sometimes those identities can be very, very hard to bring together. And it was difficult for me to bring friends home because our home was so different to their home. And my parents were so different to their parents. And the way that they behaved was so different to how their parents behaved. And there was just a whole bunch of things, ways of behavior that my English friends couldn't possibly understand, that I couldn't possibly, you know, it was, the disconnect was too large. But the one thing that we could do, and I could invite people back for, which was completely universal, was food. So we would, you know, my mother was still is an amazing cook. And so that was one way in which I found it easy when I was a child and younger and having a problem with my own identity as a refugee child landing in a dominant culture. That was the one place where we could meet, those cultures could meet, we could be proud. It didn't need centuries of explanation. It wasn't controversial. You know, Iran at that time had just had this revolution televised that looked very violent. It looked very anti-Western. In the 80s, it was the Iran-Iraq war. So if there was any coverage of Iran at the time, it was, you know, women in chadors with Kalashnikovs looking terrifying. So being Iranian was really difficult but having Iranian food was not difficult. Yeah, it was not something that had to be controversial. It was not something where we had to explain. It wasn't a place where we had to feel responsible for this craziness that was happening in our country. You know, we didn't have to apologize for the hostage situation. We didn't have to be responsible for what Khomeini was doing, because the food was not about the revolution. The food was not about the politics. The food was not about any of that. The food was about us. The food was about us and our land and our history and how that had traveled. And it's really only been in reflecting on thinking about today that I've really thought about how actually it was through the sofre. Sofre, you know, in Farsi and Arabic, it means it's kind of where you eat. It's literally the cloth that you throw on the floor that you sit and eat around. But your sofre is like, you know, your table, your hearth, your. But it was really our sofre that was the one thing about my culture that I was absolutely unambivalent about. I loved our food, you know. I didn't have to reject it in order to find my own identity. And I didn't have to explain it. And we could just all get together and enjoy it. And I guess that's what I really want to talk about here, you know, and what we probably want to touch on is an aspect of food, which is that it has this beautiful ability to absolutely just kind of embody almost our identity, our culture, you know, our separateness, what makes us unique and special. That's my cuisine. You know, you're not going to find a khoresh qeime bademjun in India or in Beirut. You know what I mean? That's it. That's me. That's Iran. But it's a really unambivalent way to have your identity. It's something that's gone through the ages. It's made you. You know, the food that you and your race have eaten is what's helped form your bones and your DNA and who you are now, literally that. And there is absolutely nothing like, you know, a taste of something to take you straight back to a memory or home somewhere. So when I was a disaffected teenager trying to be like a kind of, I don't know, whatever it was, new romantic in the 80s and not care about Iran and not go to Iranian school and not speak Farsi, but, you know, walk up and down the King's Road in winkle pickers. And the one thing that I just never ever had to really question was how much I loved the food, how great it was, and how much I wanted to share that with everybody. You know, everything else in Iran had become so tainted by the revolution. And our cuisine in those days, I think there was like one Iranian restaurant in London. So if I wanted to introduce it to anyone, they had to come to our house. And it was an easy way, you know, and that's what we want to do, isn't it? We want to be able, in all of these great migrations and movements around the world, we want to keep our identity and be proud of it. And we also want to be able to share it without all of the difficult political questions around that. You know, I go around and I promote this book. And so I have had people saying to me, you know, in deepest England, you know, what gives you the right to be here? Those things are really difficult, right? They're really difficult. Borders, are you right? You know, do you have the right to be this? There's so many hard questions around the movement of people and displacement and, you know, someone turning up in someone else's country and who decides all of that anyway. But food just bypasses all of that. It's the most effective way to make somebody who is far away from home feel at home. You know, Kashi, you had a great scene in your book, actually. I remember where, you know, you took the refugee girls to a party and the host had made a Nigerian dish. So it's an easy way, you know, to welcome people, also to show people that we are open to them. And it's a great way to find common ground. We all need to eat. We all like something that's delicious. And my goodness, you know, when my mother came to see me in Florence, I would go to the market with her. She couldn't speak Italian. They couldn't speak English. I couldn't speak Italian. But my mum and those stallholders, they had so much fun together because they somehow spoke the language of food and you know, and the gestures and how much and how many. And this brings me back to why, you know, the second book and why I'm here, why I fell in love with Italian tomato and why that had the power to change my life quite so much. Because when I came to Italy, I came to write this first book. I came to stay for a month, and that was 11 years ago. So one of the things that absolutely compelled me and made me feel actually at home, and at home, not in a British home, an Iranian home, was when I first went to the market. I'm not going to bore you with any more readings. They're all in the book. But you'll see when I first went to the market in Florence, it was like going back to Iran. It was rediscovering that connection with the food that we had lost. In the UK, we had our food, but food in the UK didn't seem to have that same connection. It didn't have the same role in people's lives as it had always had in Iran, in our home, and that I rediscovered when I came to Italy. In the UK, of course, now we have this great movement where, you know, the food scene has really taken off, but it's still different, right? It's still really different to how food is related to here or in a country like Iran, where your daily life, the seasons, they really shape, you know, your rituals. They shape what's going on. So what I found going to Florence and going to the market, only being able to buy what was available, what was in season, you know, I couldn't buy something if it was the wrong time of year. And the fact that everyone was so excited, you know, I'd walk there one day and they'd say, great, you're here. Look, it's the first zucchini of the season, you know, and that was exciting. I spent these years in London, you know, pushing a trolley around soulless aisles in supermarkets, you know, wanting to do anything but be there. You know, I hated that kind of shopping. But coming to Italy really put me back in touch with that kind of enjoyment, with that sort of that link back to the land, you know, your produce, where is your food actually coming from? You know, the fact that you're buying this lettuce, it's still covered in dirt, you know, it's not it's not served in a sort of plastic coffin in a cellophane shroud, you know, it's there and you can touch it. It's come straight out of the earth, maybe this morning, maybe yesterday, whatever. And that sense, that thing that actually you're allowed to be excited because, you know, it's the first, I don't know, what do we have of this? The first artichokes of the season are in now, or the bacelli have just come in and they're amazing, you know, or these tomatoes. And I fell in love with the tomatoes. And I stayed because of tomatoes, because I went home and I ate my first Italian tomato and it took me straight back to my childhood, where we would come home from school and they would give us tomatoes and we would bite into them like apples with a little bit of salt and then, you know, and they were just the sweetest, most amazing things in the world. And then, you know, 30 years of really tragically tasteless British tomatoes that looked really pretty but just not quite delivered. Now, in the 10 years that I've been here, they've gotten much better. So actually, you know, it's improved a lot over there. But here it was just that. I can say it was the quality of the produce, and it was, but it was what that meant to me. It was where that took me. It was the connection that it made for me back to that part, back to where I had come from, which gave me a real feeling of comfort, of being home. Like I understood how this culture worked without having to understand it, because I understood its rhythms. I understood that its rhythms were done around the earth and the actual land. And that was just so wonderful and such homecoming and so enriching that I stayed. And as I said to you, Charlotte, the other day, I fell in love with an Italian man a year later, right? But I fell in love with the tomatoes first. And I think, you know, the tomatoes were a much more compelling reason to move countries. Honestly. Well, you know what? I've just been, that'll be next year, right? Tomatoes versus men.
We've got to be a little careful.
Yeah.
Because we've got a 7 o'clock appointment.
So,
Debate. So would anyone like to ask questions? We've probably got 5 minutes. Right, where's the...
Shall I give this?
Yes, I'd just like to know what's... hello. I'd like to know what's happened to Persian Iranian rice. Because I had friends when I was a student who'd been married to an Iranian and spent a few years there, and she told me how marvelous the food was. This was in the 70s before, And she said, oh, the rice was incredible. The rice, best rice in the world. So a few decades later, a Persian food shop opened in Peckham in South London. Persepolis, yeah, great place. And I thought, right, that's it. I'm going to get me some of that rice. And the lady there who was, she said, oh, we haven't got any. You can't get it. They don't produce enough. And she sold me a box of basmati rice, which I could get anyway. And she said, oh, this is the closest we've got. There you go, have that. And so what's happened to the rice, this fabulous, famous rice?
Well, yes, it's one of our great passions and pastimes of Iranian people is to sample different rices around and ring each other and go, oh, I just had their rice. Oh, there's this rice. Go and buy it right now. Yeah. I think that, so in Iran, it's a little bit complicated, and I'm not 100% up to speed, but obviously there's all sorts of things that happen with food production, with the regime. Anecdotally inside the country, they say, we sell off the best stuff and they keep the shitty stuff for us. I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know whether it doesn't get exported, Iranian rice. I don't know if that's to do with sanctions or how difficult it is to do business. You'd be amazed at what sanctions affect. Because even while right now what's back is American sanctions, so in Europe should be okay. Lots and lots and lots and lots of European companies just can't do business with Iran because banks won't take Iranian money because of American sanctions, right? So it could be sanctions. We tend to we have to do a lot of hunting around for the right rice. And at the moment, my mum is using a very nice long grain rice from Pakistan that they produce. I'll send you a picture of it when I'm home. Well, I mean, that's actually, there's an Iranian shop in Florence now, and he's got some Iranian rice, and it seems like it's okay. So I don't know whether your woman in Peckham isn't being a bit lazy. Or maybe she's keeping it for herself. Yeah, I mean, she might be. She definitely might be. But if you, there's lots of Iranian shops around the place now. Obviously, you not necessarily don't want to try that hard, but I know there's places that, and they sell it in kilos and great big bags like this. There's some from Iran, there's some from Pakistan, but when the kind of shopkeepers, that you can trust them, that what they've got is kind of good enough, because our rice is very long grains and it's not sticky and it's not just regular basmati, but yeah.
Do we have time for another?
Yeah, let's say.
In Toronto, where I live, and we have, it's a very diverse city, many immigrants. And there's a place in Toronto that looks awful. It's 3 very large tower blocks where many newcomers come and often live in these apartments in shifts. So they have families, several families, some living in the daytime, some at night. It's a very interesting place. It actually has the highest concentration of PhDs of anywhere in Canada. And it's a very successful place. And one of the things that's happened is that, and there's an awful commons. It's really an awful looking place. But somebody just realized that there were all of these people, mostly women, who had these fantastic ways of cooking. And so somebody set up tables outside, and they started to just sell and share their food. And more than any of the social programs that were paid for by government, that thing created strength of community, and then of course became an attractor for the many other people in the city who, now have highfalutin tastes and love international food. So, and my father also loved tomatoes, by the way. My fondest memory of my father is him eating a tomato.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's exactly it. Food is the most powerful, non-political, easy lovely way to get together and to share, you know, and to get to know each other and to share each other's culture, you know, and it's always lovely when people are curious. I mean, it's changing now in Florence. We've got a little tiny Iranian restaurant there, but you know, people also have to be open. I've had Italian friends come to my house and drink, you know, Iranian tea from a little Iranian teacup, looking very, very scared indeed, you know. So you can't force that on people. They're not ready to have a new experience. That's fine. But when people are open and they want to go and try it, I think it's such a great way for us all to connect. And it's such a great way for us to find things in common, right? When I was doing all of my travel writing, it struck me. I was thinking, this sort of bitter orange in Iran that we make a lot of jams and things from is called naranj. Oh, but look, in Spain, oranges are called naranja, and then in Portugal they're called laranja, and here they're arancha. And that got me thinking, how has that happened? Where has that orange come from? What is that telling us? I've never quite gotten around to it in my life to write that book, you know, where you can follow, you know, certain foods across the world and tell probably so many stories by. She's done beautiful, exactly. And actually there was a lady who's written a book about lemons, I think, as in Italy as well, that's also really interesting. So just that idea of, you know, how and dishes, how they've traveled through. So, you know I'll always feel happy in a country that has a version of stuffed vine leaves, because that basically means somewhere they've encountered my culture, you know. So that gives me a whole swathe of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, where I know that, you know, we've all had something to do with each other. So I find that also a really compelling way to remember that we're not separate. Our cultures, these nations, these borders, we're not separate. What are these lines that we've drawn, you know, in maps?
Okay, just to be very quick about it, but because I think I don't think about black and white, but good and bad, twining and tangling. So at the same time, all of that is very true, and I actually believe very deeply that what we love shows a great deal that is very important. But, you know, I was in England, visiting in England. I used to live in London at the time of the Bradford protests. So, you know, something else can rise up. I mean, there are things, not just political borders, but there are cultural borders that can become almost impossible for us to understand. It was incomprehensible when that was going on. Lots.
I have a question actually, but I left it for the last moment. Before, I wanted to share with you the fact that 2 years ago, a Danish student of a master course I direct spent her internship in Colombia, where food and having food together is a mean to cope with the long-term civil war they had, and to let people from different factions in the country to meet again and rediscover the fact they are a country. And despite the fact they have always been speaking the same language, actually they've been divided so deeply that needed a mean to join again, and the mean was food. So it's totally consistent with what you explained so well. The curiosity is, did you discover exactly where that tomato was sourced? Because, you know, for Italians, for an Italian, the fact that you refer to it as an Italian tomato is totally unsatisfying. I'm sorry, but I don't want to sound unpolite, but actually, did nothing.
I should have said, not just a Florentine tomato, but grown in the Orto of Bagnoli,
and possibly also the variety, you know, because Florence has a fantastic tomato for salad that is the Costoluto one, but, you know, but actually, for us, it's kind of, you know, if we were there with you and you were having that tomato, 3 Italians would have suggested 3 other varieties of tomato you should have been tasting the same way.
This was one of the greatest joys of writing this book.
Yeah.
Actually, I do have a writ for about 2 pages where I name all the
Thank you for sharing.
I'll tell you this because my husband was really upset with me last year. I have a little vegetable garden.
Great.
And I also do this thing where I disappear all of August to London to work, and he has to take care of it. And last year I got really overexcited and I planted, I think, 10 different varieties, but like something like 50 plants and tomatoes, right? So the guy who came to dig it up for me, he didn't say anything to me, but he went to my husband. He went, "Man, I told him all your pats, but you're going to be eating tomatoes for the rest of your life." And I was like, good, that's the point. Yeah. What else do we need? You know, just gorgeous.
Okay, Kamin, I'd like to very much.
Thank you.
The moral of the story is that food is like diplomacy.
Absolutely right. Food diplomacy.